The Montana wind roared across the Bitterroot Valley, a wild beast tearing through the snow-laden pines near Virginia City. 1874. Eli Whitaker, 30, lean as a whip and tough as barbed wire, trudged through the twilight, his worn boots crunching the frozen earth. His long brown wool coat flapped against his striped cotton shirt, and his wide-brimmed felt hat shadowed eyes that had seen too many hard winters. The cold was an old friend. It meant silence, a world that asked nothing but grit. Beside him limped Rusty, his hound, a grizzled shadow with one ear torn and a hind leg dragging like a ghost's chain. Rusty's bones showed through his matted fur, but his nose twitched sharp, cutting through the frost. Tonight, he was restless, pausing at every turn. Hackles raised, a low growl rumbling deep. Eli adjusted the red bandana at his neck, scanning the horizon. Nothing but snow, swirling like embers from a dying fire, and the bruised indigo of a fading sky. Just another evening in a land that offered no quarter. Then Rusty froze, his growl sharpening to a snarl. He bolted left, vanishing into the white haze. Eli didn't shout. Panic wasn't his way. He gripped his rifle tighter, his breath steaming, and followed, the snow stinging his weathered face. 20 yards on, a scent hit him sharp. Wrong. Not deer, not blood, but something human. Something broken. There, beneath a twisted pine, she lay a woman, curled tight as if the earth had tried to claim her. Snow crusted her calico dress, its pale blue fabric torn, the lace at her collar stiff with frost, clinging like a shroud. Above, her lace veil, delicate as spun moonlight, snagged in the branches, fluttering in the wind's cruel grasp, torn between freedom and burial. Eli knelt, his breath catching. Her skin was blue as chipped porcelain, her chestnut hair matted with ice. Cracked lips trembled, a faint rattle escaping her throat life hanging by a thread. Not dead. Not yet. He moved fast, wrapping her in his wool coat, its warmth seeping into her frozen form. She weighed nothing, fragile as a sparrow with shattered wings. Her arm slipped, and something fell, a half-burned envelope, edges charred, smudged with soot. Eli tucked it into his pocket, his eyes locked on her face. Rusty circled, whining, then led the way back through the blizzard. No questions, no hesitation, just the crunch of snow and the weight of a stranger in his arms. The cabin loomed from the darkness, a low log structure under a snow-heavy roof, its chimney trailing wood smoke like a whispered prayer. Inside, the hearth glowed, embers pulsing from the morning's fire. Eli didn't light the lantern. Shadows were old companions. He laid her near the fire, swaddling her in wool blankets, easing off her tattered boots. Steam rose from her thawing dress, curling like spirits unbound. Her hands were torn, nails splintered, and bruises dark. Deliberate marred her skin, marks no stumble could leave. He saw them without staring, his gaze cautious, like tracking a wounded fawn, knowing one wrong move could break her further. He fed the fire slowly, each log placed with care, wary of shocking her with too much heat. She didn't stir that night, but Eli stayed close, mending a rifle strap by firelight, the flames dancing across her hollow cheeks, painting shadows soft as a lullaby. Once, just before dawn, she moaned a fragile sound, like ice cracking on a spring river. It split something in him, a fault line buried under years of solitude. dawn broke, pale and relentless. Eli fed Rusty, split logs, cleared a path to the barn rituals that steadied a tilting world. When he returned, she was awake, her eyes wide and dark as storm clouds, staring at the rafters like they held her lost dreams. He said nothing, knelt, and offered a tin mug of warm broth, its steam curling like hope. She didn't take it. Hours later, he tried again. This time, she sipped, her hands trembling, just enough to fend off death. 2 days passed in quiet offerings broth, blankets, silence that didn't wound. He watched her gaze at the fire, searching for warmth's meaning, as if she'd forgotten its tongue. On the 3rd day, her voice broke free, rough as gravel. "You didn't leave me out there." He didn't look up from paring potatoes, his knife steady, wasn't planning to. She swallowed, the sound raw. There was a letter. He nodded toward the table, where the charred envelope lay, a relic of her past. She tried to sit up, wincing, her body frail. He moved to help, then stopped, sensing her need to rise alone. She managed, slow as dawn creeping over the Rockies. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice a breath. He hesitated not from secrecy, but because the word felt worn from disuse. "Eli." She closed her eyes, nodded, as if the name echoed from a forgotten song. Her name came later, when the wind had stilled and the snow lay quiet. "Clara," she whispered, barely audible. Clara Beaumont. The air froze. Rusty's head lifted, ears pricked. Eli's heart lurched. That name, he'd seen it scrawled in his brother's reckless hand, on a letter tossed into the stove with a laugh. Clara Beaumont, the Eastern Jill Nathaniel had courted with sweet lies, promised a homestead, a ring, a life. But Nate had fled south chasing gold, women, or both leaving her to cross a continent for a betrayal. Eli hadn't seen his brother since. Now, here she was, in Nate's wedding dress, her skin bruised by the world, her voice fragile as wind over dry sagebrush. She didn't know him, couldn't know the brother who stayed, who buried their father alone when fever claimed him, who ignored her letters because they weren't his to answer. She didn't ask why he was silent, and he didn't offer. Some truths were too heavy for words. That night, as Eli dozed under a patched quilt, Clara knelt by the hearth, prying up a floorboard. Beneath it, a tin box his father's keepsake, stuffed with faded papers. She opened it, her fingers trembling, and found the ledger, its pages brittle as old vows. There, between cattle counts and seed orders, was her name in his father's steady hand, Clara Beaumont, expected arrival. February 1874, a promise inked with faith in his youngest son. Eli woke, saw her staring at the page, and closed the book gently. He sat in the dark, not angry, not surprised, just struck, like finding a cameo in a dust-choked trunk, fragile and impossibly precious. She slept deeper now, her breathing steady, her face softening in the lamplight, edges smoothed like spring-thawing frost. He wondered how far she'd walked before collapsing, who'd seen her suffering and turned away. Her story was etched in her blistered feet, her bloodied stockings, the way she flinched at his shadow. It wasn't his to demand. Not yet. Morning brought chores, and in the barn, Eli found his mother's old chest. Inside, A gray wool shawl, soft leather ankle boots, a sprig of lavender tied with ribbon, brittle but fragrant. He dusted them off and left them by the fire, wordless. Clara's eyes lit, a faint smile breaking through, and she wore the boots all day, their leather molding to her steps like a second skin. By the fifth evening, as the fire cast golden ribbons across the room, she asked, "This your land?" He nodded, sharpening a knife, his jeans patched at the knees. "What's left of it? You like it?" He glanced out the window, where snow fell soft and slow, like a hymn. "It's quiet. Quiet suits me." She met his gaze, her eyes mirroring the fire's glow. "Me too." Rusty dozed, his head on her knee, and something stirred in Eli's chest, slow and warm, like embers catching a new breath. He didn't know what she wanted, whether she'd leave when her strength returned, or if she'd ever forgive the man she'd crossed mountains to marry. But for now, she was here, her breath mingling with his in the warm air. That was enough. The storm that brought her had passed, but another loomed not of snow, but of secrets unspoken, heavy as iron. Yet Eli feared no storm. He'd walked through tempests that left him alone amid ruins. And this time, he wasn't alone. Mornings dawned pale, the world hushed, no birdsong, just the groan of snow-laden pines. The cabin held warmth in quiet places between the hearth stones, under the shawl draped over her shoulders, in the kettle always steaming, the bread slathered with honey, the coat left on the chair nearest the fire. Never offered. Just there. Clara stopped asking if she was a burden. Her words were sparse, like coins saved for a rainy day, and her comfort with silence felt like kinship. One morning, she watched him sharpen a knife outside, his cotton sleeves rolled up, hat shadowing his eyes. She lingered at the window, then stepped out in her soft boots. The snow half melted at the threshold. The cold nipped at her homespun skirt, but she didn't flinch. "You always work like that?" she asked, her voice stronger now. He looked up, his gaze unreadable. "Only when there's work to be done." She nodded at the blade, glinting like ice. "That's sharp enough." He shrugged, but a ghost of a smile tugged his lips. Their silence wasn't hollow, it hummed, alive with unspoken understanding. That evening, as she reached for the kettle, her wool bodice sleeve slipped, revealing bruises, yellowing now, long as fingers, layered like a brutal artist's strokes. Eli's face didn't change, but his hands stilled. He didn't ask, and she didn't offer. But when he set the kettle in her grasp, his touch was so gentle it stole her breath. Later, by the fire, she sat cross-legged on the rug, her voice a whisper. "I waited 3 days at the station in Virginia City. Train left me in the cold, and I waited. Thought he might be late. Thought I'd got the day wrong." Eli leaned back, arms crossed, listening like he had all the time in the world. Her words came slow, dredged from a well of pain. Folks stared, I asked after him, but no one knew his name. Some said he'd never lived here. One man swore he'd gone south. Another saw him in Butte, arm in arm with another woman. Her hands shook, clutching the shawl. I ran out of money, couldn't afford the boarding house. A woman at the Mercantile told me to go back east. I said I didn't have an east anymore. Outside, the wind battered the cabin, a beast begging entry. "I walked," she murmured. "No plan. Just hoped I'd find work." or someone who knew him. Then the storm hit. Eli didn't speak, just tossed a log on the fire, the flames flaring like a vow. He rose, pulled the ledger from under a tobacco tin, and opened it to a page near the end. Here. She leaned in, her breath catching. Her name, inked in his father's steady hand. Clara Beaumont, expected arrival. February 1874. She traced the letters, her fingers trembling. Your father, he said. Kept good records. She looked at him, eyes searching. You're his brother. His jaw tightened. Nate's brother. Yeah. She sank back, realization dawning. You knew? I didn't. Not at first. She didn't ask why he'd stayed silent. She saw it in the way he thumbed the ledger's edge, avoiding her gaze. You stayed, she said softly. He didn't. Eli nodded, barely. Left a lot behind. The next day, she mended his wool coat, its lining torn from shoulder to hem. He hadn't asked. She'd found it on the hook and sat by the fire, stitching neat rows with a needle from his drawer. When he returned, he stared at the coat like it was a stranger. You didn't have to, he said. I know, she replied. And he wore it anyway. A rhythm settled between them, mornings splitting wood, gathering eggs, her body still aching but uncomplaining. He asked small things, her favorite tea, sugar or molasses, where she had learned to sew so fine. My aunt, she said once, raised me after Ma died. Said a woman's gotta know how to mend what's broken. She taught you well. He said, didn't teach me what to do when something's too broken to fix. He didn't offer platitudes, just nodded, and that was enough. One afternoon, a knock rattled the door. Clara flinched, her hand grazing the fire poker. Eli opened it slowly, his broad frame filling the threshold. Eleanor Hayes stood there, gray silk bonnet framing her braided hair, her rabbit fur-lined cloak dusted with snow. She carried cloth and a jar of lard salve for Clara's burns. Heard about the girl, she said, her eyes flicking to Clara, wary by the hearth. Got a room above the mercantile if she needs it. She's staying, Eli said, firm but not sharp. Eleanor's gaze lingered. Folks'll talk. Let 'em, he said. Always do. She left the goods and a cinnamon-scented loaf, her parting glance heavy with concern. That night, Clara baked cornbread from it, the cabin rich with its warmth. Eli took a bite, his eyes softening. Best I've had in years. She smiled, real this time. Just the cinnamon. He shook his head. It's the cook. Next morning, he brought her a shawl from the chest gray wool, soft as a sigh. She ran it through her fingers, afraid it might dissolve. You sure suits you, he said. That evening, as the sun gilded the snow, he set an old oil lamp on the table. Pa read by this. He said, kept it burning till dark. She struck a match, the amber glow bathing her face. Then let's read. He pulled a dusty almanac from the shelf, and they took turns, laughing when she misread prairie wolf as plains fox. His laugh was a rare, rough thing, like a stone rolling free after years. Later, she sat by the window, shawl draped over her shoulders, the moon rising through skeletal pines. I dreamed of open country, she said. Skies that didn't press down. Dreams change, he said. Some die. Some wake up new. She turned, their eyes locking, and saw a man who didn't save her from pity, but from a shared understanding of being left behind. That night, on her cot by the fire, she whispered to the shadows, I'm not mad at you. Nate? Not anymore. Eli paused, just long enough to hear. Snow fell lightly the next day, melting on the cabin's roof. He hung his coat on her hook. Not his, a quiet claim. She noticed, said nothing, and stirred the stew, the firelight weaving them closer. Not love, not yet, but trust, its roots sinking deep. Days lengthened, frost dripping by noon, sap stirring in the trees. Clara moved easier, her steps lighter, her flinches fading. The bruise on her cheek dissolved to mist. Some nights, she hummed washing dishes, soft tunes without words. Eli let them fill the silence, a melody of healing. They didn't speak of Nate, but his ghost lingered Eli's long stares into the fire, Clara's glances at the veil hidden under her cot. One evening, she opened a small box from her boot, a charred letter, a faded photograph of a whitewashed house with a porch swing, a dried flower pressed in Bible pages. She spread the letter on the table, its words half burned. My dearest Clara. The rest was ash. She didn't cry, her grief had quieted, like a scar felt more than seen. She handed Eli the photograph. He sent this with his third letter, said he built it. Eli studied it, his face unreadable. It's from a catalog, saw one at the mercantile. Folks dream of houses they'll never own. Her smile was faint, bitter. Should have known. No, he said, his voice low. You deserved a man who didn't lie. The fire popped. Rusty's tail thumped once, and Clara's voice softened. I wasn't foolish, just lonely. He met her eyes. Makes two of us. Spring teased, snow melting, trees budding. Eli took her to the Bitterroot River, their boots sinking in mud, rich with thaw. She spoke of childhood dreams running from her aunt's house, chosen by a brave man who saw her. When Nate wrote, I thought it was the start of everything. She paused, then smiled faintly. Now I think beginnings come quiet, sometimes after endings. He picked up a smooth stone, pressed it into her hand. River wore it soft. He said, no edges left. She held it, warm from his touch, and placed it on the cabin's windowsill beside another she'd found, their shapes fitting like old friends. That night, she sewed a patch on his Sunday shirt, her needle flashing. Don't mind fixing things, he asked. I like giving them another chance. He nodded. Figured as much. Over cornbread and coffee? She spoke of her aunt's lilac garden, its blooms so thick the bees sang past dusk. Eli rummaged in a cupboard and pulled out a dusty jar of lilac honey. Eleanor's, he said, forgot I had it. She spooned it onto her bread, the taste like bottled sunlight. And for a moment, the world was just warmth, memory, and the man across the table who asked for nothing he wouldn't give first. Their bond deepened, not with grand gestures, but with steady acts her mending, his quiet questions, their shared silences. One morning, Eli left for Virginia City, trading furs. Clara tended the cabin, feeding chickens, sweeping ash, scribbling thoughts on old paper. When he returned, mud-caked and weary, he handed her a parcel wrapped in brown paper. Inside, a sky-blue ribbon, mint tea, and gloves fitted to her hands. I don't know what to say, she whispered. He looked away. You're worth more than thanks. She pressed the gloves to her cheek, and his gaze held her. A moment he'd carry forever. That night, she braided her hair by the window, snow melting on the roof. You never asked why I stayed, she said. He paused, a log halfway to the fire. Didn't seem like a question that needed asking. I stayed, she said, because I breathe easier here. He sat, the fire etching his tired face. That's all the reason I need. The words settled between them, a letter sealed but unopened. Weeks later, a rider came, dust trailing his mare. Nathaniel Whitaker, 3 years younger than Eli, but aged by broken promises. His smile too slick, his buckskin jacket too fine for the trail's grit. His silk shirt was rumpled, his derby hat tilted jauntily. Eli was stacking wood when the hoofbeats sounded. Rusty snarled, hackles up. Hell. Nate grinned, dismounting. Didn't think that old mutt had it in him. Eli's hands tightened on the axe. Didn't think you'd come back. Nate brushed imaginary dust from his black trousers. Didn't plan to, got business to settle. His eyes flicked to the cabin, where Stu's aroma drifted. Smells good. That her. The axe sank deep into a log. Where is she? Nate's voice softened, but his eyes were hard. Inside, Eli said. Nate's grin widened. Good. She's mine. You know, got papers to prove it. Eli's voice was low. Dangerous. You left her. Can't claim her like a lost package. Nate stepped closer. She came for me. My bride. She's got her own name, Eli said, yanking the axe free. Clara stepped onto the porch, the blue ribbon woven into her braid, her gaze piercing Nate like a blade. He doffed his hat, bowing low. Clara, darlin'. You look fine. God help me. She didn't move, her face stone. I'm back. He pressed. Got held up in Idaho. Meant to write. Did you? Her voice was calm, a blade sheathed. He nodded too eagerly. Missed you. She tilted her head. What's her name? The woman in Butte. His mouth opened, closed. Ain't what you think people talk, she said, her voice crisp as fresh linen. So did you. He stepped forward. Eli shifted, but Clara raised a hand, not in fear, but command. I walked through a blizzard, she said. Slept in barns under tarps. Thought I'd die. Never spoke your name. Stopped hoping you owed me anything. Nate's face twisted. Not with guilt, but the sting of being seen. I know I hurt you, he said. We can fix this. Start over. Her smile was cold as winter. You don't start what you never meant to finish. Eli moved closer, not looming. Just there solid, unyielding. She's staying, he said. Nate scoffed. What's this? Think you can take what's mine? She's not yours, Eli said. The words a quiet thunder. Nate's eyes darted between them. Finally seeing the unspoken bond, he spat, mounted his mare, and snarled. You'll regret this. Both of you. Dust rose as he rode off, a fading specter. Inside, Eli sat by the fire, Rusty at his feet. Clara stirred the stew, her hands steady. He was right about one thing, Eli said, his voice rough. I loved a woman once, lost her to fever before we could wed. Thought love was a one-time deal. Kept to myself. Worked the land. He met her eyes, the fire dancing in them. Till you. Her gaze softened. You still think that no, he said. A vow? Not anymore. She set down the ladle, crossed to him, and touched his cheek. Her hand sure. Then don't wait, she whispered. Not if you found it again. He leaned into her touch, and Nate's shadow his charm. His lies dissolved in the fire's glow. That night, Eli opened a cedar box, revealing his mother's gold wedding band. Simple but strong. He didn't speak its meaning. He didn't need to. Clara traced its worn curve, her eyes bright. "It's not fancy," he said. "It's enough," she replied. They sat by the fire till midnight, her head on his shoulder, the silence full of promise. Outside, stars burned through the pines, and the wind sang of spring. Months later, as they built a new cabin by the Bitterroot River, Clara found a letter in Nate's old buckskin jacket, hidden in the lining. It was addressed to Eli, dated a year before her arrival. "Brother, I'm leaving. She's coming Clara Beaumont. I lied to her, promised her everything. If she finds you, send her away. She's nothing but trouble." Eli read it, his face unreadable, then tossed it into the fire. Clara watched the flames consume it, her hand in his. "You didn't send me away," she said. He squeezed her hand. "Never would." They turned to their new home, its frame rising against the Montana sky, a testament to a love forged in truth, not promises.